Gresham College presents Mad, Bad or Sad by Professor Glenn D. Wilson.
Thank you, Frank, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm going to be talking about personality disorders and some of the problems of diagnosis within the field of mental health and or illness. You probably recognize this is a scene from a film called Fatal Attraction, in which the character played by Michael Douglas is a happily married man who thinks he can get away with a one-night stand with the character played by Glenn Close. And it's a bit of a cautionary tale because, as you no doubt know, she doesn't go away quietly afterwards and completely wrecks his life. Let's see if we can move forward like that. Yes, you have no doubt been up to speed with the news that a certain celebrity chef, whose name I won't mention, was caught shoplifting from his local Tesco's. Not just on one occasion, but apparently he had been doing it habitually. He cited overwork, stress, various aspects of an unhappy childhood, being sent to boarding school, being abused by relatives, but still claimed that he was a bit baffled by his own motivation and announced that he would immediately enter therapy. Now, was he a little bit mad, a little bit sad, a little bit bad, or maybe a bit of all three? What might have seemed a very simple issue at one stage in history has now become rather complicated. There are many psychologists who are concerned about the use of diagnostic systems to classify maladaptive behaviors as illnesses when they might be better understood as being on a continuum with normality. There's a tendency to be medicalising behaviours that might just seem distressing or upsetting, either to the individuals concerned or to those about them. And to some extent, this may be encouraged by medical insurance companies and drug companies who have their own interests involved. Medical insurance payments in the United States very often depend upon a diagnosis being assigned, a medical-sounding label of some kind. Drug companies love diagnoses because once a behavior has been classified as an illness, then they are able to identify drugs that can be applied to it, and others will be developing surgical procedures to address them. Consider the rather phenomenal rise in the diagnosis and treatment of something called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, ADHD. It's usually abbreviated as. As many as 1 in 5 American children are taking Ritalin, a stimulant that is intended to treat hyperactivity. Prescriptions in Britain have doubled in the last 5 years. Despite the fact that there is no satisfactory medical test for this condition, no clear way of deciding whether or not a child is suffering from it. And in fact, the behaviours for which it is prescribed sound rather typical of naughty, inattentive little boys, mostly, especially those who are on fast food diets, who lack exercise, who stay up late to watch TV or play video games, and whose mother smoked during pregnancy. Nobody's quite sure about the long-term effects of stimulants on the developing brain of a young boy, and there's concern about financial incentives in the form of disability allowances that may be paid to the parents of children who achieve this diagnosis of ADHD. Something similar seems to be happening in the case of women in depression. There are twice as many women as men that are diagnosed as depressed, and if one is to go by the prescription of antidepressant drugs like Prozac, the rates of depression seem to be soaring, again, particularly in women. Now, I've no doubt depression is a real condition, But what would account for this escalation? Is the lot of women really that much worse than it was previously, despite all the efforts of women's liberationists? That seems a little bit unlikely. And one has to wonder whether aggressive marketing on the part of drugs companies has something to do with this. Those of you who were around, like me, in the 1960s and 70s will recall that enormous numbers of women who went into their GPs complaining of anxiety or just difficulties in coping were prescribed tranquilizers, minor tranquilizers such as Valium. These went out of fashion when they were discovered to be addictive. And it appears that antidepressants have taken over as mother's little helper. They may turn out to be addictive as well. We're not quite sure. It's interesting that the NICE guidelines, the National Institute of Clinical Excellence, say that talk therapies, like cognitive behavior therapy, should be the first-line treatment. But these are rather difficult to arrange. They are in short supply. Many so-called sexual disorders would have been considered normal variations in the past. Now anything less than bedroom bliss is treated as a disease. Women who have orgasm difficulty or suffering from what is called hypoactive sexual desire, lack of interest in sex, and that's perhaps around half of the female population, are now recommended testosterone-enhancing drugs. And about a quarter of men suffer premature ejaculation at some time or another, particularly when young. They are now offered things as drastic as radiofrequency nerve ablation in order to reduce the strength of the pleasure signals that are conveyed from the genitals to the brain. It seems rather extreme, given that time might have the same effect, either boredom with the partner or aging of the individual. I'm sure it's a self-correcting problem. Sex addiction, what used to be called promiscuity or infidelity, is also recommended for the reverse, anti-testosterone therapy. And one of the things you have to be a little bit concerned about is who are some of these treatments intended for? Who are they supposed to benefit? The patient themselves, or perhaps their partner, somebody else who finds their behavior troublesome? The classification of mental disorders is a movable feast. The best known system is the American Psychiatric Association DSM-4, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, 4th edition it's in currently. It's under review at the moment, and drafts have been issued by the APA task force. We're expecting the final DSM-5 in 2013, next year. Various new conditions have been considered for inclusion. Here are some of the interesting ones. Absexuality is sometimes dubbed the Mary Whitehouse syndrome because it refers to the thrill of being appalled by salaciousness. You might recall that the anti-porn campaigner Mary Whitehouse was so upset by Kenneth Tynan's use of the F word on television that she wrote to the Queen saying that he should have his bottom spanked. Little realizing that he might possibly have enjoyed that. Other possible categories that have been suggested for inclusion include hebephilia, which is a sexual attraction to pubescent adolescents, young adolescents, just below the age of legality. There is one called sluggish cognitive tempo disorder, which you might better understand as laziness. Negativistic personality disorder, which means whinging. Nicotine use disorder, otherwise known as smoking. And intermittent explosive disorder, I think, is already in the list, actually. It just means adult tantrums. Well, maybe not all of these diagnostic categories will make the final list. Absexuality, I have to admit, has been put forward by one particular sexologist, a feminist called Carol Queen, so that may not gain the consensus necessary. But some of them will get there, and of course, the more diagnostic categories we have, the more business there is for therapists out there, and the more potential profit for the drug companies in producing cures for them. In fact, we may just be medicalising eccentricity or just plain bad behaviour. The sociologists are concerned about this. They say that we risk losing the distinction between people who are genuinely mentally ill and those that are showing normal stress responses to social conditions such as loss of status, resources, and attachments. Their concern, of course, is that if we diagnose it as a mental illness, then we go straight to drug treatments and so on, rather than considering improvements in social conditions that might be at the root cause of some of these distressing illnesses. A notable thing about these DSM categories is that they are agreed by committee and consensus. And of course they will evolve with time and with the cultural context. At a time when homosexuality was illegal in the UK, up until the 1960s, it was regarded as an illness, and it had its own numerical code within the DSM. It was originally, in 1953, the first DSM, it was described as sociopathic personality disturbance, SPD. 1973, the DSM second revision, it was called sexual orientation disturbance, with the unfortunate acronym of SOD. In 1980, they dropped the idea that homosexuality in itself was a mental illness, but came in with the diagnosis of ego-dystonic homosexuality, meaning being homosexual and not wanting to be, not enjoying that condition. In 1987, that was dropped, EDH was dropped, but it crept back in under this rather vague heading, sexual disorder not otherwise specified. One of the examples being persistent marked distress about one's sexual orientation. Where's it going to go next? What's going to happen in the DSM-5? Nobody quite knows, but political correctness is getting so powerful that we might have a new condition that they describe as homophobia. It already sounds like a mental disease, doesn't it? So it's incredible that within a few decades we have gone from the point of throwing people into prison for homosexuality to threatening them with prison if they don't like the idea or pronounce against homosexuality. That seems to be the way we're going at the moment. Most clinicians, of course, don't regard homosexuality as an illness. But nevertheless, a recent study by Bartlett and company found that 17% of UK mental health professionals had treated homosexuals, have treated clients for homosexuality in the past, and 4% said that they would continue to do so in the future, despite a lack of evidence that sex orientation can be altered by therapy and the possibility that it might actually do harm. Then there's the idea of sexual addiction, which, as I say, we used to call things like promiscuity and infidelity. It's likely to become hypersexuality in the DSM-5. It seems to be promoted by feminist demands that that men stop philandering, which paradoxically, because it's a medical-sounding name, is sometimes embraced by men who are seeking an excuse to deny responsibility for their bad behavior, perhaps with their arm twisted seriously up their back by an angry spouse. The message, of course, being, it's not my fault, I can't help myself, I am in the grip of an addiction and I need treatment. But, of course, evolutionary psychologists point out the fact that the pursuit of multiple partners is typical of men. It's something that is driven by testosterone. And so-called hypersexuality seems to be indistinguishable from high libido, any measure that you can take of sex drive. Of course, if your libido is excessive, it can get you into terrible trouble. It can destroy your marriage and your family stability. It can lead to charges of sexual harassment and rape, in which case some self-control therapy might be appropriate. But once again, I would say that the important thing is that the therapy be in the interests of the client, not others who might want them nobbled or restrained in some way or another. The issues surrounding psychiatric diagnosis are particularly salient with respect to personality disorders. Down the left is the list, current list of personality disorders in the DSM-4. They cluster into three groups. There is the odd-eccentric group, which includes paranoid, schizoid, and schizotypal personality disorder. There is the dramatic, erratic cluster, which includes antisocial, borderline, histrionic, and narcissistic personality disorders. And then there is the anxious, fearful cluster, which includes avoidant, dependent, and obsessive-compulsive personality disorders. Down the other side are the personality disorders recognized by the ICD-10, which is an alternative classification of mental diseases favored in European countries. International classification of disorders, I guess the D is. And it's in its 10th revision at the moment. It's got a similar list of personality disorders, just fewer of them. And obsessive-compulsive they are calling anancastic, for reasons that escape me, because it's not a word that is understood by most lay people. Probably that is its perceived advantage within medical circles. Now, there are obvious problems with the personality disorder categories as listed in the DSM and the ICD. They are determined by consensus or committee rather than any form of psychometric logic. Their reliability is poor in the sense that same patient given to several different diagnosticians, they'll come up with different labels for them, with particular overlap occurring within those three groups, so that, for example, borderline is likely to be confused with histrionic and narcissistic more often than borderline will be confused with anancastic. So there's a great deal of overlap, and what in medical terms they call comorbidity. That is, sometimes they will diagnose you as suffering from two of these personality disorders simultaneously. And the overlap is greater within the three clusters. Perhaps the biggest problem of all, as seen by academic psychologists particularly, is that these categories are on-off categories. The clinician has to say yay or nay. This person either has this disorder or they don't. When in the real world, we know that there tends to be a continuity between people who are 100% normal and those who are extremely potty. Most people are somewhere on a continuum between the two. And the DSM categories do not, at the moment, recognize that. Another problem, from the point of view of research psychologists, is that the diagnostic category incorporates certain exclusions which amount to making guesses about the etiology of the disorder while you are in the process of labeling it. So that, for example, you do not call something a personality disorder if it has been induced by stress, or by brain damage, or by drugs, or if the condition is better described as neurosis or psychosis. There are a whole lot of other categories that you put people in if you decide that they are neurotic or psychotic. Personality disorders have to be separate from and exclude all of those. So it's a monumental job attaching these labels, and it involves you in second-guessing how they might have originated before determining the label that you put on them. And the final problem may also be very important, is that the labels can be used as just a jargon for insulting other people that you don't like or don't like their behavior. And more than that, it can be stigmatizing. It can affect their future or other decisions that are made about them. I was, some time ago, asked by a solicitor to look at a lady who was a rape complainant. They were acting for the guy who had been accused of rape. And their hope was that I could classify her as personality disordered so that doubts could be raised regarding the credibility of her testimony. And in fact, she did exhibit many erratic and theatrical behaviors that you could describe as histrionic. She was a recreational drug user. She'd smoked cannabis on the night in question, together with the alleged assailant, who incidentally was an ex-boyfriend. She had a track record of lying about her sexual activities and throwing a tantrum when the lie was exposed. On the particular night in question, she had invited the defendant to her house late at night, greeted him in pajamas, smoked marijuana on that night, and after the supposed assault, she accepted a cigarette from him before rushing outside into the corridor of the block of flats, totally starkers and screaming rape. But despite all that, I refused to attach the label of histrionic personality disorder. And the reason was that I felt that this could have been used unfairly to discredit her, when in fact it was nothing more than a description of the kind of behavior that she had exhibited, and took us no further forward than describing how she had actually behaved. Princess Diana was sainted after her tragic death, but up until that time, she was widely accused of being personality disordered. And I was approached by the media on many occasions, journalists wanting me to say, well, was she borderline, was she histrionic, was she narcissistic, or all of those things. And again, it was a game that I refused to play, partly because it could have got me into terrible trouble with my professional society, and partly because I don't think that psychiatric labels should be used in that kind of way, regardless of the inducement from Fleet Street. Borderline personality is a particularly vague category. It It's described as extreme black and white thinking, instability in mood and relationships, problems with self-image and identity, and inclinations towards self-harm and suicidal tendencies. Now, it's diagnosed 3 times as often in women as it is in men, and it's not at all clear that these particular traits that are listed cohere meaningfully at all. And it's also not clear what the border is between. I think historically it referred to a twilight area between neurosis and psychosis, when you weren't quite sure whether they were neurotic or psychotic, and hence you called them borderline. It later became listed as a personality disorder. But there's very little agreement as to how it might be treated, and I get the impression that self-harm is the real key defining characteristic. Without that, borderline doesn't seem to be so often applied. Perhaps one of the other personality categories would be attached. Is there such a thing as a split personality? It's a very popular term amongst lay people. And, of course, the picture is the famous case of Jekyll and Hyde, which might be thought of as a case of split personality, or alternating personalities. The idea of multiple personality gained a great boost with a film called The Three Faces of Eve, made in 1957 and based on a best-selling book. Eve exhibited 3 distinct selves at various times. Eve White, as she was called, was well-behaved and considerate of other people. Eve Black was hedonistic, malicious, and destructive, while Jane, the third personality, was just somewhat bland and dependent. Eve White knew about Eve Black and was scornful of her, Eve White knew nothing of Eve Black, but Eve Black knew about Eve White and was scornfully dismissive of her. Jane knew of both the others and expressed a wish to meet them. Now, this condition of Eve was supposedly, in the clinical write-up, induced by child abuse, and it was cured by hypnotherapy, according to Thigpen and Cleckley, who wrote it up in the clinical literature. Both of those claims were subsequently denied by the patient herself, the Eve in the story, who said, no, I was not cured by hypnotherapy. In fact, I was never cured. I still have these personalities. And child abuse had nothing to do with it. Actually, I wasn't abused as a child, was her later statement about this situation. The case of Eve was trumped in 1973 by that of Sybil, who claimed 16 separable personalities, and incidentally was also a best-selling book. Now, this is an extremely rare condition. It's now called dissociative identity disorder. And it's, although it looks a bit like histrionic personality, it's in fact classed as a neurosis within the DSM, not a personality disorder at all. Seems a bit arbitrary to me. Again, it's a condition that is mostly female, which would suggest a link with what might in earlier times have been called witchcraft or possession. And they had a treatment for that too, burning at the stake. I'm sure that was effective. Today it's more linked with other dissociative phenomena like hysterical paralysis, sleepwalking, hypnosis, depersonalization, out-of-body experiences, psychomotor epilepsy, a condition in which you do things that you are not aware of having done, and lycanthropy, of course, people who believe that at the full moon they turn into werewolves, which is closer to the Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde case, which of course was fictional. As I say, it's a very rare condition, and the sincerity is very difficult to assess. Most cases that are reported continue to be in the United States rather than, say, the UK, and it's likely that some of them are coerced by therapists, rather in the way that false memory syndrome is now recognized as being. A therapist will go looking for it, if only because they can make a fortune out of the book and the film. They will perhaps suggest these personalities to their patients. The hillside strangler, Kenneth Bianchi, tried to fake multiple personality to prove, to support an insanity plea. He was discovered to have psychiatry textbooks hidden under his mattress in his cell, and he particularly marked the pages on dissociative personality disorder in the hope that this might help his case. It didn't, incidentally. He was treated in a way more similar to the way medieval witches were treated. And perhaps justifiably, considering the crimes that he had on his record. Now, a general difficulty in making psychiatric diagnoses, I think, is well illustrated by the case of David Icke. Previously, he was a TV sports presenter, very successful one, and he was a spokesman for the Green Party. He once declared himself the Son of God in a television program, which he claims he hadn't quite meant, but it just sort of slipped out. And he got a lot of publicity for that. He now maintains that the world is ruled by alien, shape-shifting lizards from the constellation of Draco. Included among them are the Queen, Tony Blair, and George Bush. Lots of powerful people are apparently lizards disguised as human beings. He's a bit suspicious of his wife at the moment. I think he said she was beginning to look a bit lizard-like, and he's suing her for divorce on those grounds. Now, it would be easy to dismiss Icke as barking mad. But here's a man who is fully functioning and successful. He's handsome, articulate, persuasive in his public lectures. He sells countless books and CDs. There's a TV channel that is almost exclusively devoted to his talks. He attracts numerous desirable women. Had a whole team of them back in the 80s that were decked out in turquoise shell suits. A whole team of female acolytes followed him wherever he went. And he's currently selling tickets for a Wembley Stadium appearance. I think the tickets are selling like hotcakes for later on this year. So, what are we to make of that? I was once taken by the Sun newspaper along to one of his book launches. And clearly they wanted me to say he was crazy, so they could quote me as that in the newspaper. But rather diplomatically, I came out by saying, no, I don't think David Icke is mad, but I'm not so sure about the people who buy his books. Now, of course, Icke is one of several people to prove that a very good way of getting extremely rich is to start a religion. Another one was L. Ron Hubbard, a failed science fiction writer who set up Scientology and has done extremely well out of it. I think that also claims that human beings are from some planet in outer space there somewhere. I've forgotten which one. But are the ideas of these latter-day prophets much crazier than those of mainstream religions? Richard Dawkins would certainly say not. He would say that all gods are delusional. But you can't treat every religious person with antipsychotic medication. And if their religion provides a source of identity, belongingness, some sort of psychological comfort to them, then who is to say that it is not good for them? Now, so far I've discussed mostly the perhaps the sad and the mad, getting a bit more onto the bad. One of those categories in the DSM was antisocial personality disorder, referring to a pervasive disregard for the law and the rights of others. And of course it overlaps with a more familiar term, psychopathy, which has been tipped to make a comeback, incidentally, in the DSM-5. Psychopaths are described as feeling no empathy for other people, no guilt, no remorse for the things that they have done. That's one key defining characteristic. Others have suggested that the lack of concern for the feelings of other people is actually secondary to an impulsive need to pursue gratification due to an overactive dopamine reward system. There are studies to suggest that that is at least a contributing factor. Other traits of psychopaths, of course, they can be extremely glib, charming, and intelligent. Example here being Ted Bundy, known as the campus killer, another serial killer operating in the west coast of America, who killed numerous young women, partly using his charm and persuasiveness. Again, you know, from his own point of view, one could say that he was functioning extremely well up to the point when he was captured and ultimately executed. He had numerous propositions of marriage from women who were infatuated by him even after he was identified as a serial killer and was in his cell awaiting execution, because it appears that women love a good psychopath. They can smell the testosterone, I think. They are fighting over the Yorkshire Ripper at the moment. You know, women insisting that only they should be allowed to write letters to him, and vice versa. It's a difficult job for the authorities to know how to deal with that. Now, there's a strong association between psychopathy and criminality, obviously, but it is by no means a perfect overlap. Babiak and Hare reckon that about 4% of corporate executives would be clinical psychopaths, as assessed by the psychopathy checklist, which is the usual diagnostic rating scale. 4% of corporate bosses compared with about 1% of the general population. And they say it's because these men are attracted to the high-risk, high-gain culture of the corporate world, and they're not team players and are actually rather poor leaders, but by dint of their charm, cunning, and recklessness, they managed to rise up the corporate ladder. So what is the difference between those guys and the serial killers? One suggestion is that, well, perhaps they've had a happy childhood. They've been less abused as children, and that this has protected them from turning to a life of crime. I suspect that a high IQ might be part of it, because while some serial killers are highly intelligent, I think the corporate bosses probably are more consistently so. The existence of functioning, successful psychopaths in the world, of course, is further supported by the fact that many dictators would fit the diagnostic criteria of antisocial, narcissistic, paranoid, and sadistic personality disorders. Most recently, Saddam Hussein and the Libyan chap, what's his name, Gaddafi. Now, when psychopaths do commit crimes, who should take the responsibility for them? Is it something that should be the concern of the medical authorities or the penal system? Well, the usual answer has been to this point that since psychopathy is not treatable effectively, then it is a matter for the judiciary. Psychiatry can only be concerned with things that are treatable. Now that, in fact, is not quite true on either count, that psychiatry deals with a lot of things that they're not very successful at treating, and it's probably not true that there are no treatments that cannot be applied to psychopaths. Personally, I don't think it matters very much, because the real issue is one of dangerousness. If an individual represents a continuing danger to the public, then secure containment is necessary anyway, regardless of whether you call them mad or bad. You can attempt various forms of rehabilitation or treatment while they're in jail, but it might turn out that they need indefinite incarceration anyway. And it seems to me that we are confused about what prison is actually for. Is it for punishment, retribution, deterrence, rehabilitation, or just protection of the public? And in my opinion, it's only the last of those that is a proper reason for putting somebody in prison. If you remove the punitive aspect from our secure facilities, then the distinction between the health and the penal institutions becomes academic anyway. And you can make them equally humane. Punishment doesn't work with psychopaths anyway, because they are not responsive to fear of consequences. For others that might be deterred by the threat of punishment, there are other possible penalties. You can deliver extremely heavy fines for fraudsters. The Jonathan Aitkins of this world. You can give community service to juvenile delinquents. But it seems to me, unfortunately, we crowd our prisons with people who have offended, yes, but are not criminal personalities. For example, motorists that might have fallen asleep at the wheel, their car ran off the road and killed a couple of people. They may be put in prison when in fact they are not dangerous by personality predisposition. The prison is being used as a punishment and to satisfy the relatives of the people who died, when in fact there was no criminal intent in the first place. On the other hand, we give bail to people from whom the public does deserve protection. Career burglars, for example, are very often set loose when perhaps, or given a very short prison sentence, which is no good to anybody. Now, personality disorders, to summarize, are not illnesses like measles or epilepsy. We do need some sort of system of classification for descriptive and research purposes. It's been known for some time that malfunctions in the frontal part of the brain can lead to unrestrained behavior. This is the famous case of Phineas Gage, a chap who was working on the American railway. Explosive charge went off and blasted this crowbar through his eye socket and out the top of his head, and he had what was effectively the first prefrontal lobotomy in history. And although he survived, and they got the crowbar out. It's in a museum in America. His personality had changed. He could no longer hold down his job as a foreman. He wore his emotions on his sleeve. He became totally irresponsible, crying one moment, angry the next, laughing maniacally on another occasion. His personality had changed so that he no longer had any sort of emotional restraint. And it's probably the case that a lot of psychopaths, for example, have damage or impairment. They might have even been born with this impairment to the connections between emotional areas of the brain, of the midbrain, places like the amygdala, and the decision-making and control mechanisms in the frontal cortex. I've taken this diagram from a study by Motzkin et al., showing reduced conductivity in psychopaths between the emotional brain and the frontal brain in a group of psychopaths as indexed with magnetic resonance imaging. And there are many other studies like that. So we perhaps in the future need to look towards diagnostic systems that can go straight to the brain and see what's going on there. At least it's some solid evidence as to what is going on. The nightmare scenario, of course, is that some psychopaths are claiming that they should be found not guilty on a charge of murder because they are suffering from brain damage, and therefore, because they're feeling a bit better now, they might be let loose to do it again. As I say, it shouldn't work that way, because you should know that if the brain is damaged, then this person is likely to continue to be dangerous, in which case treat them humanely by all means, but letting somebody like the Yorkshire Ripper loose again would be a terrible gamble that I personally would not want to take. Incidentally, here's a good case in point. There was much hand-wringing and decision-making as to whether Peter Sutcliffe was just criminal or was schizophrenic and hence mad and should be treated differently. A case in point where it shouldn't really make any difference at all exactly whether he was mad or bad, because obviously he was not safe to be back out on the street. The three main clusters of personality disorder correspond roughly to the concepts of mad, bad, and sad. Interestingly, they also connect with the three major personality types identified by ICKE using a statistical method called factor analysis. He called them psychoticism, extroversion, and neuroticism. Now, the EPQ dimensions could perhaps replace DSM categories. There are other contenders. Some people are saying the Big Five system could be used. Others would look to tailor-made systems like Millen's multi-axial personality inventory, which was specifically designed to measure personality disorders. As I say, it would be nice if we could develop brain measurements that cannot be faked, that would give us a proper system of assessment, and which ultimately might also monitor the progress of treatment. But the first step, I think, is to recognize the fact that mental illnesses, many of them, including personality disorders, are based on continuous dimensions, and we should be looking to develop evidence-based cutoff points along those dimensions. If you think in the medical world, conditions like blood pressure, cholesterol, and obesity are recognized as continuous variables, and we have measures and we have indications of when it might be of clinical concern. And I think that's the model we should be working towards. And I should say that in fairness to the American Psychiatric Association, there are those in the working party who are urging that we change in this direction for the DSM-5. So I hope that happens. Thank you very much.
For all information, please visit www.gresham.ac.uk.